I was very much a believer in interesting openings to draw the audience in right at the beginning. And on this one, we used flowing liquids which in slow motion, which we then double printed. And with the very quiet music starting to build and build to set the situation for the audience before the picture actually started. And my theory was, whether the theory was right or wrong, was that these were all interior pictures. They were pictures based upon the unconscious mind. I did not want to show reality. At the beginning of the House of Usher, I showed the young man about to come to the house coming through a burned out area. There was no burned out area here, and I felt the thing to do was to show John Carr coming against the ocean. Although it's reality, there are various, if you follow strict Freudian beliefs, about the ocean and various qualities to it. It's where we all came from, and I use the ocean with a rocky background. This shot here, where John is walking the castle, was, I think, along the Palos Verdes coast, and then it was, of course, a painting, a matte shot of the castle on top of the cliff. By the way, I should introduce myself. I'm Roger Corman. I produced and directed The Pit and the Pendulum. Barbara Steele's credit comes a little earlier than it probably should if you were to judge just the importance of the characters in the picture. But Barbara was an English actress who had been working in Italy primarily and had become something of a star in Europe. So for our European distribution, we moved her name up. Now here again, as John approaches the house, I shot down. I had a dolly angle moving with him, again, not to show reality. Also the fact that I was on a soundstage and there was no particular reality to shoot. This was a cut back to the Palos Verdes coast, deliberately obscured by fog.
Yes?
I wish to see Don Medina. My name...
I'm sorry. Don Medina is not receiving visitors at present.
The Pit and the Pendulum starts in a somewhat similar way deliberately to the House of Usher, in which the young man, played here by John Carr, approaches the house, is introduced to somebody at the door and is led into the house, but not yet introduced to Vincent Price.
I'm sorry. Won't you come in, Mr. Barnett? Please forgive me. I'm Catherine Steele.
Donya?
Will you not spend the night, Mr. Barnett? I'm certain that my brother would wish it.
Perhaps, Donya. May I see your brother now?
The young actress is Luana Anders, a very, very good young actress who had a reasonably good career and later became a writer and a successful writer.
Perhaps at supper, if you would do us the honor.
Very well. At supper. May I visit my sister's grave now?
Grave?
I presume there is one.
Not as such, Mr. Barnett. She is interred below.
Oh?
I deliberately did not use a caption saying where, when, anything like that. I felt the film stood for itself. Also, people who came to see it had seen the previews or had seen the ad, and I felt we didn't need that kind of a crutch. This was the stairway that we had originally built for the House of Usher. Now we put a little foreground composition, modified it a little bit, and reused it.
When did she die? Your brother's letter made no mention of the date.
About 3 months ago.
3
The
months?
Pit and the Pendulum looks a little bit bigger than the House of Usher because we had stored all the flats from the set for Usher and brought them out and built some new ones. So with each succeeding picture, the Poe picture started looking a little bigger because we were able to build upon what we had done before.
What's that noise?
Please follow me, Mr. Barnett.
We introduce here in the background the sound of the pendulum, but without saying what it is, just to let the audience know, possibly unconsciously or subliminally, that there is something happening.
Not that way, Mr. Barnett.
And the sound stops. And then Vincent comes in a very sharp, close shot. I introduced him in the House of Usher in a somewhat similar way, but coming through a quick opening of a door. Here I varied it, but used the same basic idea in having him come from the right.
I thought that you were.
That noise, sir.
It is an apparatus, sir, that must be kept in constant repair.
The reference to the noise, the apparatus that must be kept in constant repair, which could be taken a little bit humorously or not, is setting up eventually what will be the pendulum.
My apologies, sir. Shock and grief restrained me from more adequate communication. You have every right to be provoked.
Perhaps
John Carr had a very good career. He started on Broadway, played several leads there, and played several leads in Hollywood, and I believe eventually decided to become a doctor and went to medical school and is now a practicing doctor.
Now perhaps you'll be good enough to tell me how my sister died.
An illness of some degree.
Luana was an actress in this film and became a screenwriter. John became a doctor.
Dr. Leon, a physician of repute.
And he
And
decided...
Vincent remained an actor all the way. Although Vincent became a writer as well. He wrote several books on art and I think one book on cooking.
I'm afraid so.
And I'm afraid that does not satisfy me, sir.
Follow me.
It's interesting that in both the House of Usher and in the Pit and the Pendulum, the dead members of the family, the ancestors, are buried in the crypt beneath the house. When we eventually did The Raven, which was a more comedic approach to this, Vincent says to Peter Lorre, who has just entered the house, my late wife is buried in the crypt below. And Peter says, where else?
The night. And more, sir. Until I know exactly what has happened here.
Again, when cutting outside, I cut to the ocean, just as I had cut in House of Usher to the burned out area in the hills. Here I kept cutting to the ocean. I wanted to show exterior to break up the series of shots inside the house, but not to show reality or the pleasant landscapes that I felt would interfere with the mood of the film.
Yes?
I trust that you will be...
The paintings here are somewhat different than in The Fall of the House of Usher. In Usher, they were much more impressionistic. Here, they're closer to reality. I wanted a different look. But in retrospect, I think I prefer the impressionist, almost surreal look of the paintings in Usher.
Painfully aware of your distrust regarding Elizabeth's death.
This is an example of where you try not to repeat yourself,
I beg of you, do
and in
not-
reality, you were right the first
A
time.
word is not enough. Too many things need fuller explanation before I can be satisfied that what you say is true.
Fuller explanation? Yes. Come with me.
There was no second unit on these films. Everything was shot in 15 days. The first day was at the ocean, and with just a skeleton crew. And then we came for 14 days to the soundstage.
Why have you brought me here?
It is her room, sir. I've had it kept exactly as she left it. Look around you, sir. This room was furnished and arranged with dedicated love. Every article of furniture, every decorative detail is the work of a master craftsman of Italy or Spain or France. Indeed, every country in the civilized world is represented here. It is a unique room. I did it all for her.
There's a somewhat more opulent look to The Pit and the Pendulum than to The House of Usher. We were using, to a large extent, the same sets, the same flats, although we expanded them and built new ones. But we deliberately went for a somewhat more luxurious look in simply going to the prop houses and renting the things we wanted, because this, of course, is the house of a nobleman in Europe, in Spain, whereas in Usher we were at a private house in New England.
Without her, life is meaningless. She was the very substance of loveliness. I tried to capture it. But it was the way she walked and moved. Her smile, her voice. She sang like an angel. And she could play the harpsichord as no other woman I have ever known could play it. Every night, after we had dined, she would play for me. Please forgive me. I had not intended to so display myself.
For Vincent to cry at this point in the film was a little bit unusual at the time. Leading men or lead character actors generally did not display quite as much emotion as is permissible or fashionable today.
Do you live in London, Mr. Barnard?
Yes. And you?
In Barcelona, with an aunt.
And, have you been here long?
A little over a week. I came to be with Nicholas because I... Who would that be?
This was one of the most difficult of the Poe pictures to write. The original story only concerned the sequence with the Pit and the Pendulum, whereas with the House of Usher, there was enough characterization from which to build a screenplay. Here there was almost nothing. So we used the Poe story really as the third act and created the first two acts as much as we could in the spirit of Poe.
Dr. Charles Leon at your service, sir.
Doctor?
You are, I understand, Elizabeth's brother. The resemblance is clear. The coloring, the same configuration. Beautiful woman, your sister.
Doctor.
Ah, my dear. I've interrupted your meal, I see. Proper timing was never my fault.
We are just finished. Won't you join us in a glass of wine, John?
Delighted. So, young gentlemen, you've come all the way from England, have you?
That's right.
Terrible tragedy, your sister's death. Appalling business.
How are things in Bastan, Charles?
What? Always, Nicholas. Buying and selling, living and dying, the weave of life.
Why did my sister die, Dr. Leon?
Have you not been told?
Of course he has.
Well, then.
I want to hear it from you, Doctor.
The structure of this scene was deliberately designed to show that the doctor is ready and willing to discuss the death of the sister, whereas Vincent is trying to stay away from it as much as possible.
Cass.
It's too late now, Charles. I didn't want him to know.
Know what?
Your sister's death was caused by a failure of the heart, sir, due to total shock. Literally, she died of fright.
Why did you not tell me?
I thought to spare you, sir.
You thought to deceive me.
That's not true.
What is all this?
Show me where it happened.
Very well.
No, Nicholas.
There is no other way, my dear. We were wrong. Very wrong to have kept...
Here's an example of my attempt to get depth in the shot. I like to have open doorways. And in that shot, although we panned away from it at the moment, we had the characters in the foreground, the open doorway to the room behind, and then a fire burning in the fireplace at the far end of the other room.
Well?
Most of the props of the torture devices and so forth were built for the film, although a couple of them we were able to rent from prop houses.
A torture chamber?
Yes, Mr. Barnett. It was my father's.
Sebastian Medina, one of the Inquisition's most infamous, degraded...
Please, sir, that is enough.
The approach to this film was the same as with Usher in regard to rehearsal time and working with the actors. We had one day of rehearsal, which was a read-through of the script, a discussion of the script, a second read-through, some improvisations, and then some blocking out on the sets that had been built. The Screen Actors Guild charged for rehearsal time, and American International was willing to pay for one day of rehearsal. I helped that a little bit by meeting individually with actors before shooting and discussing their roles, going over motivation and so forth. So that would not technically be called a rehearsal.
This was my father's world, Mr. Barnett.
Spare yourself at least this, Nicholas.
How can I spare myself? Was he not my father? Am I not the spawn of his depraved blood?
His depravity.
There was a great deal of Freudian theory behind these films. Whether or not that theory comes out, I'm not certain, and maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it should remain subtextual, as it were. Freud's theories were more popular in those days, or more believed than they are now, but I was working with them very intensely. I'm not certain any of the other directors were, at least to the extent I was.
Never have brought her here. She was too sensitive, too aware.
Aware of what?
The malignant atmosphere of this castle.
The concept of the house or the castle, to Freud and to me, really represented a woman's body. The door, the front door, was the vagina. The movement down the corridors, continually I had people walking down long corridors, which was a sexual visualization.
Particularly this chamber. But it did not bother her at first either. Our life was good, rich with the shared pleasures of our love.
Here we are again into one of our fantasy sequences. We were a little less elaborate in the fantasy sequences here than in Usher because, again, we were based a little bit more on reality. But they were fun to work with. We used special lenses, special lighting, and did some reprinting with different colors laid over the original and draining some natural color out.
Enjoying intimate conversation, sometimes with the doctor.
Barbara Steele was very, very beautiful. She's worked with me recently, of course, considerably older now, but has retained that great bone structure. A very handsome woman.
And then the darkness began to fall. More and more, entering her room in the mornings, I would find her awake and discover that she had not slept all the night. I tried to find out why, but she had no explanation. Her appetite began to fade. She began to lose weight and color. I tried to make her eat, but something kept her from it. I would come upon her wandering in the corridors at night. I tried to find out what was wrong, but she never had an answer except to say that...
The music here is very important, and I think Ronnie Stein, the composer, did an excellent job. I worked with him in a somewhat looser fashion than most directors do. I would talk to him about the scenes where I wanted music and the mood I was looking for, but everything else I left to him. Very often directors will go to the recording session. I never did. I felt Ronnie is the composer and the conductor. What can I say to him in a recording session?
Now tormented her as well, infecting her with a kind of haunted fascination. I watched her drawn to one and then another, as if the aura of pain and suffering which surrounded them was luring her to sickness and to death. Immediately, I made my plans to leave the castle with her. We would travel for a while, restore her spirits, and then make our home elsewhere. Then, on the very eve of our departure, we heard a scream from below, the most hideous, blood-chilling scream I have ever heard in my life.
Well, that one was set up because he says we heard a scream from below.
Just before she died, she whispered a name. Sebastian. Sebastian.
You'll notice that coming out of the fantasy sequence, even though we are in the dungeon where the lighting is generally dark, at that point I raised the points, as it were, which is how you time a picture. I raised the points on the print several degrees in order to get a slightly brighter look, just to contrast with the darkness of the fantasy sequence.
I have come to ask you to please believe him, Mr. Barnett. He has told you the truth.
Has he?
Yes. In not telling you before, he only meant to spare you pain. He is a good man, Mr. Barnett. A kind and gentle man. And I know that he adored your sister.
I would like to believe him, Doña Medina, but I find
The
it...
comment about the timing of the print is, I think, an indication of the way in which you can make decisions all the way from the beginning to the end, starting with the original idea as to what picture you're going to make, the way you're going to adapt it, the way you work with the writer, then how it will be produced, how you cast it, how you shoot it, how you edit it, the music, the sound effects, and right down to the final print, where you do have some control.
One day, while Nicholas was playing in the lower corridor, he had been forbidden by...
We're deliberately using some classical, if not old-fashioned techniques, such as the closing of the iris to lead us into the silent fantasy sequences. I was looking for almost any effect I could get to vary from reality, to take us into an unreal world, and going back to some techniques from silent films I felt could do it.
Suddenly, there were footsteps. It was our father. With him were our mother and our Uncle Bartolome, who was our father's brother.
Vincent, of course, is playing his father here, and he's using techniques that have been done before to indicate the change in character. He is now a fully evil man, or at least heavily evil.
For some inexplicable reason, our
The
father
limp,
was
the expression on his face, he's changed from the previous character.
Nicholas could see that both our mother and our uncle were uneasy, frightened. Our father's smiling affability as he described the workings of these hellish instruments turned Nicholas's blood cold. He watched them with a mounting sense of premonition. Something was wrong, most terribly wrong. Even he, no more than 10 years of age, could sense it like a darkening vapor in the air. There was no reason for our mother and our uncle to...
The effects here actually look pretty good as I look at them after all this time for the low budget and the somewhat primitive technology we were working with.
Adulterer, adulterer.
They were partially done in camera with special lenses and filters, and partially done in post-production.
Debaucheries with his brother, cursing her as faithless, promising her the agonies of hell in payment for her infidelity. And there, before my brother's very eyes, our mother was tortured to death. Ever since then, Nicholas has been unable to live as other men. Always he is haunted by the memory of that terrible day. Your sister's death came very close to driving him insane, Mr. Barnard. I beg of you, have pity on him. Help him by believing him.
I will try, Doña Medina.
Well, I know you must be very tired from your journey. Good night.
Doña?
On a picture such as this, I would have a month or so of pre-production. I would start pre-production from the first draft script, because Dick Matheson was such a fine writer that I knew we did not have to go through the multiple drafts that you sometimes do with other writers. I knew that our first draft would be very close to the final draft. And I wanted to go over the plans of the sets with Danny Haller, the art director, so that I could start sketching my shots from the sets before they were actually built.
Who is that?
I'll see.
There is a nice moment where Luana comes in from the right, again, just breaking the frame. Not an attempt to get a great shock, but just slightly unsettle the audience.
I don't understand. Surely it's your brother.
No, Nicholas has never played the harpsichord in his life. Maria.
And again, we break the screen here as the maid comes in from the right, again, just to unsettle you slightly.
Nicholas.
The sounds of the off-screen noises, the sound of the harpsichord, the sound of the pendulum, are all ways to indicate something beyond what one sees, that we are in a world of which the visual is only a part.
Locked? Yes. Is there another door?
There is not, sir.
Much of what we're doing, of course, is based upon the fact that we have a low budget and a fast shooting schedule. But the use of these off-screen sounds, while occasionally it's done for economy, was in general planned and done for effect.
It was she.
Come, drink this.
Thank you.
Hers?
This was my second film in CinemaScope, and looking at it, I think I may have been using it a little bit better here. I was filling the screen with more objects, with more depth. Maybe that's a matter of just that I had a little bit more money and I could rent more set dressings and so forth to put in. But the look here, I think, in general is good.
What I am about to tell you, no one in this world except Nicholas and myself knows. That is, I thought that no one else knew. Take this.
No.
Drink it. To be absolutely blunt about it, Nicholas believes that Elizabeth may have been interred prematurely.
What?
The concept here of premature burial ran through a number of Poe's short stories, including, of course, the story The Premature Burial, which I did, I think, third or fourth in this sequence. And there are various Freudian implications there.
No, my dear.
I've always believed that scientific movements or concepts come when they're needed and are invented or discovered both by artists and by scientists. I think as Freud was working in a scientific way on the concept of the unconscious mind, I think Poe, writing a little bit before Freud was working, was anticipating the same thing in his writings.
Nicholas broods about it constantly. Already he has told me he has heard Elizabeth walking the corridors, even that he has heard her speaking his name.
Dr. Leon,
Sir?
you seem to forget that we all heard the harpsichord play.
No, I have not forgotten it, sir. It is why I said before that I thought that no one but Nicholas and myself knew about this.
What do you mean?
Someone, I fear, has discovered Nicholas's secret and is using it as a terrible advantage. A servant, perhaps.
Danny Haller, the art director, did a fair amount of research to try to make these sets within our limited budgets as accurate as he could. We had, of course, the problem that we were reusing sets and adding to them as we went from picture to picture. So it was done partially in the sets themselves and partially in the set dressings.
Dread is unwarranted.
If Elizabeth Medina walks the corridors of this castle, it is her spirit, not her living self.
Here's a shot of the full great hallway in which I used a wide-angle lens to make it look even bigger than it actually was.
What is it, Charles?
The pan shot around the room here is a little bit different than the way I use pan shots in other sequences in which we pan to reveal something of significance. The point here was that nothing of significance was revealed.
I was cleaning up the room, and she spoke to me. She called me by my name. Maria. She said, Maria, leave this room.
My wife spoke to you. My wife spoke...
Nicholas!
No one will ever enter that room again. Mr. Barnard, I'm afraid...
No need explaining, Nicholas. Mr. Barnard knows everything. Take care of the girl, will you, Catherine?
I'll see to it, Doña Medina, if you want to go with your brother.
Thank you.
Come, Maria, let me help you downstairs.
Perhaps I should bring some food to Nicholas.
You will not eat it, my dear, any more than you are eating yours.
I'm not hungry.
You need your strength, nonetheless.
If I may interrupt this fascinating conversation for a moment.
I was using a lot of moving camera here, like that dolly shot behind the chairs. The problem from a directorial standpoint is that we had only 4 or 5 sets, a couple of which were reusing the same sets, in which to make an entire picture. And one way to do it was to use a lot of camera angles, a lot of movement of the actors, and a lot of movement of the camera itself.
Describe it, Doctor, because it only whispered to her.
This point seems of vital import to you, doesn't it?
Don Medina! Don Medina! The key to Elizabeth's room. The key, I said.
Again?
Do not go then, Nicholas.
I must.
Now we see the room significantly.
Nicholas. Come.
We're playing to a certain extent with the audience here. We're raising the possibility that we're dealing with supernatural events, and gradually we're beginning to suspect that it was not supernatural, that something terrible in reality has taken place.
What I have dreaded all these months has come to pass.
You're wrong, Nicholas.
No. No, she...
All of this, of course, is a creation partially of mine, but primarily of Dick Matheson's, the writer, of the first 2 acts of what one might consider to be a 3-act picture, of which the 3rd act was actually Poe's story, and the first 2 was Dick's invention and creation of the characters to lead us to what Poe actually wrote, because of a story based upon what Poe wrote would be about a 15-minute motion picture at most.
Enabling you to whisper to Maria without being seen. Then, after the door to Elizabeth's room had been locked by you...
The attempt was to use concepts and themes that Poe developed in The Pit and the Pendulum, but also worked with in some of his other stories, so that we would maintain a consistency of thought and of approach through the first 2 acts, which were created by us, and when I say us, I really mean Dick Matheson primarily, to reach what Poe actually wrote, which was the scene in the room with the pit and the pendulum. You could think of it in one way as our creating a 2-act prologue preparing you for the actual pit and pendulum.
To punish myself?
No, Nicholas, no. One of the servants is responsible, most likely Maria.
Could I have kept that ring without knowing it? Played the harpsichord without knowing it? Destroyed Elizabeth's room all without knowing it? My inner mind creating evidence of Elizabeth's vengeful return because that mind knows. but I don't know. I will find out.
No.
It's the only way, Catherine. It's the only way.
Vincent really was a brilliant actor. He was able to convey the intensity and the madness of the character, bringing it to its fullest extent without going over the top. We were very careful about that, to try to make it a full emotional performance, knowing that for motion pictures, and particularly for close-ups in motion pictures, the actor has to hold back a little bit. These films did have some influence on other filmmakers, partially in the United States, and particularly in England, where a company named Hammer made some somewhat similar films. So I like very much some of the Hammer films. Vincent also worked several times for Bill Castle, who was a good friend of mine. Bill was a very good director and a great showman. He was playing a little wilder than I was. He did things like The Tingler, where the seats were slightly wired to give you a slight shock at the moment of suspense or shock. And another one, he had a skeleton fly out on wires from the screen. I never quite went that far. Now, the walling up of the unfaithful wife used here was actually used by Poe in several other of his stories, particularly The Cask of Amontillado, which I shot as part of Tales of Terror. So, as I say, we were creating something of our own here, but we were trying to use Poe's themes. There is something of a shock there, and also it is a plot point, so you could call it a legitimate shock.
True! I swear to you, I thought she was dead. On my honor as a physician, I thought she was dead. I swear to you.
True. 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 True.
Nicholas.
True.
The cut to the exterior with the thunder immediately after the shot of the skeleton is just sort of an accent point, which then leads us into this scene.
Nicholas!
And then we repeat the thunder. These off-screen sound effects can add to a sequence.
I'm killed.
whole storm sequence there is simply for emotional effect, to break us out of the dialogue, to build up a sense of slight shock, and also to show the turmoil within his mind.
I would suggest, Nicholas, that you leave this place. Your remaining here cannot help Elizabeth now. Try to understand, Nicholas. I am a doctor of medicine. Never in my career have I seen a condition which so completely paralleled the physical appearance of death.
I was always aware of the fact that these were very contained, dialogue-heavy films, and we had to break from the dialogue from time to time to give the audience a respite, as it were. And that storm sequence is an example of what I was trying to do, to give us a break from the dialogue, but also have what we're cutting to of some significance to what was going on within the film.
Patience. I beg of you, leave with me.
I can never leave. I must accept whatever vengeance Elizabeth chooses to inflict upon me.
I've used improvisation a great deal in films, but I used them very sparingly in the Poe films. There was a formal quality to these films that really doesn't work very well with improvisation.
I came to apologize.
Not until The Raven, where we introduced more humor into the films, did we work with improvisation to any great extent.
I had expected. I realize now that my sister's death was an accident. I do not blame your brother. I feel only sympathy for him.
Here again, I was using a wide-angle lens to make the set look bigger.
I think I understand.
I'm sorry that our meeting should have taken place under such unhappy circumstances.
There is just a hint of romance between Luana and John, but I didn't want to take it any farther than just a suggestion. It was not pertinent to the story. It was just an interesting note to their characters, to make the characters a little bit more complex. Here again is an example of shooting from as far back on the set as possible to make the room look bigger. Camera was actually off the set for most of this.
Accept the hospitality of my carriage.
Thank you, Doctor. Good night.
Good night, Mr. Barnett.
I remember shooting this sequence. I was very concerned that it took so long to put those damn candles out. The idea was right and it was necessary for the story, but I said, Vincent, press those candles as hard as you can. Let's get them out as quickly as we can. We're going to have the audience spending half an hour watching a couple of candles being put out.
Elizabeth?
Now here we're into pure Freud, or at least my somewhat distorted interpretation of Freud. I've used this in several films. The person can be a man or woman, it doesn't make any difference, walking down the dark corridor. The corridor, of course, representing the vagina. And the audience is saying, go forward and find out what is at the end of the corridor, and at the same time saying, don't go any further. Go back, it's too dangerous. It's almost an initiation to sexuality. Whether the audience understands that or not, I don't think is that important. I think they get a feeling. They may not know what the feeling is, but seeing these pictures with audiences, you could sense the audience tensing up. You can, if you wish, take any phallic thought you want out of that.
Elizabeth? Where are you? Elizabeth?
This was all shot on one little piece of stairway. He keeps coming down it again and again by cutting, and the rat is there just to have a rat there. We cut to his feet and then cut back to him coming along the same pillar, but with a different lens and a different angle. Actually, it works. You get the impression, I think, that he's walking a long distance rather than about the 10 feet he actually walked.
Nicholas? Is my brother with you?
No, is he not in his room?
No.
He must be with Dr. Leon, then.
I will check below. You two search this floor and the one above.
All right.
We had great fun setting up these shots, the cobwebs, the spiders, the rats. Pat Dinger, the special effects man, was a virtuoso with the cobweb gun.
Elizabeth? Huh?
He walks through the cobwebs. He may notice, but he is so intent upon where he's going that it makes no difference.
Elizabeth?
Pure madness now.
Elizabeth? Elizabeth? Elizabeth?
This got a shock. Deliberately in shadow, and then out of the shadow and into the light. She had a great face.
I told you to wait.
I couldn't.
He's gone.
What about my brother?
He's supposed to leave in the morning. But now, why couldn't you wait one more day?
I've waited too long already.
So, my darling Nicholas, we've broken you at last.
Elizabeth, there is no time for this.
I've waited an eternity for this moment. There has to be time. And now, my dear Nicholas, I have you exactly as I want you. Helpless.
Elizabeth.
Is it not ironical, my husband? Your wife an adulteress. Your mother an adulteress. Your uncle an adulterer. Your closest friend an adulterer. Do you not find that amusing, dear Nicholas?
Yes.
now the plot, which I think has a few twists, starts to get a new twist.
Happening? What should be happening, Isabella?
Isabella?
You, Bartolome, my brother. How do you like my little workshop, huh?
Dear God.
Well, what ails you, brother, huh? And you, my dear, why are you so pale? Does this place disturb you? I thought the two of you would enjoy the novelty of it. Come, let me show you about a bit. Where are you going, Isabella? Bartolome! Are you leaving me? Don't you want to see my... I'm going to torture you, Isabella. I'm going to make you suffer for your faithlessness to me. Before this day is out, you will be begging me to kill you, to relieve you of the agony of hell into which your husband is about to plunge you.
Vincent deliberately goes back through this sequence to the same facial characteristics as his father in the flashback sequence. At this moment, as I recall, the audiences were really on Vincent's side. They realized what had been done to him, and now he's getting revenge.
Now, Bartolome.
It's the old statement I think they made about Erich von Stroheim, the man you love to hate. Now we come to the pit, and eventually the pendulum.
Bartolome! Where are you? You cannot hide from me, you know.
Don Medina! Don Medina!
There you are, Bartolome.
Oh, there you are, sir. We've been searching all over for you.
That's a shot that didn't quite work. I wanted the poker to come through and knock John out, but it's one of those things where in reality the poker travels so fast that you barely see it.
Are you ready now, Bartolome?
Had I had more time or been able to see the rushes and come back to the set, I would have reshot it and had Vincent swing the poker. Here is a great shot for its day. That's a match shot. We built only the section that you're seeing now. The entire shot before this was a matte painting set all around this bit of interior. The background is actually the wall of the soundstage with all these paintings on them. Danny Haller, art director, painted those, and I thought he did a really good job.
Now we are ready to begin, Bartolome.
The pendulum was made of wood with a rubber blade just to protect John when he was under there. As a matter of fact, I remember he had a couple of questions, and I said, look, John, I'll lie here while they're lighting it. I'll be the stand-in, and you'll see this is all okay. Stand in or lie down in, as the case may be.
You are about to enter hell, Bartolome.
I think we had a sharp blade for some close-ups in which we didn't have John. I don't remember exactly how I shot the scene, but I was pleased with this. I used a lot of the angles on the paintings as cutaways. So I was on them, and now we look up to the pendulum itself. Now that was there, a sharp blade. Then when it came closer to him, we had the rubber blade, and then for special effects in which we didn't have him, we just had something representing his body, we came back to the sharp blade again.
Surrounded by the waiting pit of hell.
There were no miniatures here. This was all full size.
Nicholas?
Nicholas, are you in there?
Catherine, help me!
And weirdly enough, that matte shot, which was done, 40 years ago, which would be done, of course, much better today with digital effects, looks fairly good. I'm surprised by the fact that it, at least in my opinion, it holds up fairly well.
Nicholas?
The audience did gasp a little bit on the big shot, the long shot, the matte shot. This got a little reaction too. We spent a fair amount of time cutting this sequence. Cutting it, trying different ways, cutting back and forth as to where we cut to Luana outside the door, back to the pendulum. Now the pendulum starts to move. Then back to John, now back to the matte shot.
Nicholas!
A matte shot, incidentally, I just assume everybody knows, but for those who don't, a matte shot is where you shoot only a portion of live action and then you matte or paint in the rest of the set. This was a combination of shooting on the stage, then back here to the matte shot, then back deliberately to a close shot from the long shot. Here, the foreground composition. That was the shot there where he was lying there that I said, okay, John, I'll show you this is okay. All of these intercuts to the wall were done in the last half hour of shooting. We finished the picture. We still had half an hour before we went into what is known as golden time, which is excessive payment for overtime. And I just got on a crane with the camera and the camera operator and said, let's just move this crane all over the set. I just want to photograph all of these paintings, moving shots, set shots, and everything. I'm just going to intercut them. And I don't know. Generally, I plan well in advance, but there I said, I'm just going to photograph anything that looks good, and I'll figure out where to use it. I knew I was going to do something like that, but I didn't know until I was really up on the crane exactly what. We added the sound effect to the pendulum. Now here, the very close shot, there's nobody there. That's just a dummy with a sharp blade that would be able to cut into it. And now I started to distort some of the shots. To make this sequence work, I used about every trick or technique I could think of, including moving shadows, the tight shots, the dolly shots, the pans, and of course the matte shot for the long shots. And the blending of sound effects with just not really music, almost a suggestion of it with the pendulum.
Maximilian!
I got caught up myself in describing it so much I forgot exactly what was going on.
Don Medina, he thought that I was...
It's over now.
That was a very shallow pit. I used a very wide-angle lens to give it an impression of great depth. It might even have been a 9 lens, which I don't normally use because it causes distortion. But here distortion was okay.
No one will ever enter this room again.
A line which sets up that. We ended the film with a quote from Poe, which I think we did in each of the Poe films. I like to do this to reprise the main characters at the end. It's not done anymore and wasn't done much then, but I think it's worthwhile to really give the actors full credit. And then at the end, I had the credits for myself, the writer, the crew, and so forth. It enabled us to get into the picture, I think, quickly and economically. I mean economically in time, not in money, so that the audience comes in, sees the picture, then can see all the credits at the end. And we can take time to make the credits a little bit bigger, and by giving them an interesting background like that, there's something for the audience to look at behind the credit rather than just the normal black. Once more, this is Roger Corman. I hope you've enjoyed seeing The Pit and the Pendulum, and I hope you'll have the chance to see some of the other Poe films as well.